Research can only be conducted if the principles in the regulation are followed, of course. However, there is an exemption for the processing of personal data for activities, including research, which Sweden worked extremely hard to obtain. Without this exemption, much of public records and statistical research could not be conducted. An important change is the requirement for security measures to ensure the integrity and confidentiality of data. For example, we cannot even begin to collect data without having considered where the data will be stored while it is being processed. The need for controls or the storage location may of course change while the research is being conducted, but it is not possible to start collecting data and then think about where it can be stored for now. The exemption also covers archives and statistics and exists in several places in the text of the regulation. The exemption for the processing of personal data for research purposes states that if the data was collected for one purpose, such as in patient records, it may be used for research purposes. It is also permitted to archive this data and compile it for statistical purposes. Naturally, this applies under certain conditions which are largely governed by national legislation. There is both scope and a requirement for national legislation under certain matters in the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, for research involving special categories of personal data. Such national legislation supplements the regulation, but it must all comply with it. The GDPR takes precedence. General consent. Being able to demonstrate consent does not necessarily mean that you need to have anything in writing or have recorded anything directly from the individual. However, if you only have data from individuals who decided to respond to a survey or similar, there needs to be some form of documentation for how you established consent. Consent for special categories of personal data must be explicit, which is not at all different from how it is managed today. For example, for research that is subject to ethical review. The right to withdraw consent is a central feature of the regulation. Individuals must be informed of this before they give consent and before recording or collection begins. It must be easy to withdraw consent, as easy as giving consent from the start. Material already collected is not affected retroactively. However, no data that can be identified is subsequently used or processed. Whatever sort of consent is involved, a great deal of information must be provided before the recording of data starts. Documentation of what information has been provided is therefore part of how you demonstrate that consent has been given. The GDPR makes much stricter requirements for the information that must be provided than the current Swedish Personal Data Act. A central feature, for example, is how you withdraw consent. The information varies to some extent, depending on whether it must be provided to the individual from whom the data process comes directly, or there is no direct contact with the individual. In the latter case, there is a proposed option not to provide information, primarily in research, but also for statistical and archival purposes. This is subject to compliance with any confidentiality legislation and any duty of confidentiality. However, certain conditions may still be imposed on the ethical review legislation.